Engineering miracles? The young social entrepreneurs basking in Silicon Valley's enthusiastic glow have probably not read the Spence Report. According to them, we do not know what will get the developing world to grow. They just need to adopt the latest technologies, chief among them the Internet. Mark Zuckerberg, CEO of Facebook, is a strong proponent that Internet connectivity will have a huge positive impact, a sentiment echoed in 100 reports and position papers. One report from Dahlberg, a consulting firm, tells us that the Internet is a tremendous, undisputed force for economic growth and social change, emphasis added, in Africa. The fact is evidently so obvious that the report does not bother to cite much solid evidence, which is sensible since there is no such evidence to cite. After all, in developed countries, there is no evidence that the advent of the Internet ushered in a new era of growth. The World Bank's flagship publication, the World Development Report, in its 2016 edition on digital dividends, after much hemming and hawing, concluded that on the impact of the Internet, the jury was still very much out. The Internet is just one of the technologies tech enthusiasts believe can be both a commercial success and an engine for growth for poor countries. The list of bottom-of-the-pyramid innovations that are supposed to change the life of the poor and power growth from the bottom up is long. Cleaner cook stoves, telemedicine, crank-powered computers, and rapid testing kits for arsenic and water, to name a few. One common features a lot of these technologies, though not the Internet share, is that they were developed by frugal engineers, such as the students at MIT's D-Lab, or the entrepreneurs funded by Acumen Fund, a prominent social venture capital fund. Behind this and other similar funds is the believable idea that one reason why developing countries are poor is that the technologies developed in the North are not appropriate for them. They use too much energy, too many educated workers, too expensive machines, etc. In addition, they are often developed by monopolies in the North, and the South has to pay a premium to get them. The South needs its own technologies, and for that it needs capital not available from the markets. This may be why growth does not happen on its own in many countries, and it's the gap that Acumen Fund tries to fill. While the Acumen Fund sees itself as an entirely new type of organization, not an aid organization but a venture fund for the poor countries, in a sense its technology-oriented view of growth harks back to the 1960s, when engineers dominated the aid world and went bust trying to bridge the infrastructure gap, giving large loans to poor countries for building dams and train lines that would allow them to catch up with rich countries. Despite the lack of evidence that this has helped those countries to grow, the fascination for electricity as the source of growth and development has never really gone away. Ecuador is currently under severe financial strain thanks to a loan from China to build a massive dam that was never fully operational. Acumen loans are smaller, and they are given to private actors rather than to governments, but the dream is still one where engineers will fix the world's problems. One of Acumen Fund's key sectors is electricity. The ideal source of energy has changed from large dams to power from grain husks or the sun, and the latest cool idea is that it is possible to develop cheaper off-the-grid solutions to reach poor communities, but the focus on electricity goes back 50 years. It turns out, however, that it is not easy to invent appropriate technologies that are also profitable in a poor country. A good part of what Acumen funds fails. A rule of thumb in the social investing world is that 10% of the ventures work out, the rest fold, and only 1% reach significant scale. The issue is more that it is difficult to identify those supposedly life-changing new products and services, and efforts to do so often meet a frustrating lack of interest from the people whose lives are supposed to be changed. Electricity is a case in point. In a recent randomized controlled trial in Kenya, researchers partnered with Kenya Rural Electrification Authority to offer electricity connection at different prices in different communities. The demand fell very sharply as price rose, and villagers were not willing to pay anywhere near what would have been sufficient to cover the cost of connecting to the grid, not to mention building the grid. The frugal engineering world is littered with many similar disasters, from the $100 laptop to educate the world, which actually costs $200 and has been shown to have no impact on what children actually learn, to cleaner cook stoves that nobody wanted, to various water filter technologies and innovative latrines. A lot of the problem seems to be that these innovations take place in a void, insufficiently connected to the lives they wish to change. The core ideas are often clever, and it remains possible that one day they will click, but it is hard to place a lot of faith in this prospect. Fishing with cell phones. A central tenet of all the growth theories we have discussed is that resources are smoothly delivered to their most productive use. This is a natural hypothesis as long as markets work perfectly. The best companies should attract the best workers. The most fertile plots of land should be farmed most intensively, while the least productive will be used for industry. People who have money to lend should lend to the best entrepreneurs. This assumption is what allows macroeconomists to speak of the stock of capital or human capital of an economy, despite the obvious reality that the economy is not one giant machine. As long as resources flow to their best use, each separate enterprise is like one cog in a smoothly operating machine, which spans the entire economy. But this is often not true. In a given economy, productive and non-productive firms coexist, and resources do not always flow to their best use. Lack of adoption of available technologies is not just a problem for poor households. It seems to also be a problem in industrial settings in developing countries. In many cases, the best firms in an industry use the latest worldwide technology, but other firms do not, even when it seems it would make sense economically. Often, this is because the scale of their production is too small. For example, until recently, the typical clothing manufacturer in India was a tailor who made made-to-measure clothes in his one-man workshop, rather than a firm that mass-produces. TFP is low, not because the tailors are using the wrong technology, but because tailoring firms are too small to benefit from the best technology. In a sense, the puzzle is why these firms exist. So, the problem with technology in developing countries is not so much that profitable technologies are not available and accessible, but that the economy does not appear to make the best use of available resources. And this is true not only of technologies, but also of land, capital, and talents. Some firms have more employees than they need, while others are unable to hire. Some entrepreneurs with great ideas may not be able to finance them, while others who are not particularly good at what they are doing continue operating. This is what macroeconomists call misallocation. A vivid instance of misallocation comes from the impact of the introduction of cell phones on fishing in the state of Kerala in India. Fishermen in Kerala would go out to fish early in the morning and return to shore mid-morning to sell their catch. Before the cell phone, they would land at the nearest beach, where their customers would meet them. The market would run until there were no customers left, or the fish ran out. Since the catch varied quite a bit from day to day, there were a lot of wasted fish at some beaches, while at the same time there were often disappointed customers at others. This is a stark example of misallocation. When cell phone connectivity became available, fishermen started to call ahead to decide where to land. They would go where there were lots of customers waiting and not a lot of boats. As a result, waste essentially vanished, prices stabilized, and both customers and sellers were better off. This first story spawned a second one. The main tool of trade for a fisherman is his boat, and good boats last much longer than bad boats. The technology of making a fishing boat is always the same. but some craftsmen are much better at it than others. Before cell phones, fishermen used to purchase their boats from the nearest boatmaker. But when they started to travel to different beaches to sell their fish, they often discovered there were better boat makers elsewhere, and they started to ask them to build their new boats. The result was that the better boat makers got more work, and the worst went out of business. The quality of the average boat improved, and in addition, because the better boat makers got more work, and therefore got to use their existing boat-making infrastructure more effectively, they could lower the price of the boats. Misallocation went down. The workers making boats, the equipment, the wood, the nails, and the ropes that went into a boat were all used more effectively. What is common to these two stories is that a communication barrier led to misallocation. When communication improved, the same resources were better used, resulting in higher TFP, since more was done with the same inputs. Misallocation is pervasive in developing economies. Take the city of Tirupur in South India, the T-shirt capital of the country, which we have already encountered in Chapter 3. There are two kinds of entrepreneurs in Tirupur: those who come from outside to start a T-shirt making business, and those born and brought up in the area. The latter are almost uniformly the children of affluent local farming families, the Gaunders, looking to do something different with their lives. Those who go there to make T-shirts are generally better at T-shirt making than the locals. Many have family connections in the T-shirt business, and perhaps as a result, firms run by outsiders make the same number of T-shirts with many fewer machines, and their firms grow a lot faster. But despite being more productive, Abhijit found in a study with Kaivan Munshi, the firms run by the immigrants were smaller in size and had less equipment than the firms run by the locals. The Gaunders poured money into the firms run by their children instead of doing the efficient thing, lending money to migrants and passing the interest income so earned to their sons. As a result, efficient and inefficient firms could persist in the very same town. When Abhijit asked them why they preferred to sponsor their sons rather than lend money to the more talented outsiders and live off the proceeds, the Gaunders explained they could not be sure of getting their money back. In the absence of a well-functioning financial market, they preferred to give money to their inept sons and get lower but relatively safe returns. It is also probably the case that they felt they had a duty to give their sons not only some hard cash, but also a means to earn a decent living. Family firms are common all over the world, from small farms to large family groups, and they do not always fully adapt to economic incentives. Firms are passed on to sons even when daughters would be better at managing them. All the fertilizer in the family goes to one male person's plot when it would make sense to use a little bit in all the fields. That is, of course, not just true of small farms in Burkina Faso, or family concerns in India and Thailand, but of the United States as well. Out of 335 CEO successions at family firms a researcher investigated, 122 were family successions, where the new CEO was a child or a spouse of the current CEO, often a founder or the child of a founder. On the day of the succession, the stock market returns of the companies that appointed an outside CEO went sharply up, while the returns of the companies that appointed an inside CEO did not. The market was rewarding the appointment of an outsider, and apparently the market was onto something. Firms that appointed family CEOs experienced large declines in performance in the subsequent 3 years compared to firms that promoted unrelated CEOs. Their return on assets fell by 14%. What all of this tells us is that we cannot take it for granted that resources will flow to their best use. If they do not within a single family or within a town, we clearly should not expect them to do so across an entire country. Misallocated resources will in turn lower overall productivity. Part of the reason poor countries are poor is they are less good at allocating resources. The flip side is that it is possible to grow just by allocating the existing resources to more appropriate uses. In the last few years, macroeconomists have spent a lot of effort trying to quantify just how much growth could come from better allocation. This is hard to do perfectly, but the results have been very encouraging. One very prominent estimate suggests that in 1990, just the reallocation of factors within narrowly defined industries could have increased Indian TFP by 40% to 60%, and Chinese TFP by 30% to 50%. If we allowed reallocations across broader categories, the estimates would surely be even larger. And then there is the misallocation we do not see, the great ideas that never see the light of day. Given that venture capital is so much more active in scouting out new ideas in the United States than in India, it is plausible that India is also missing more of these unsung geniuses. Banking on banking? Where does misallocation come from? Indian firms grow much more slowly than U.S. firms, but are also much less likely to shut down. In other words, the United States is an up-or-out economy, where people try something new and either succeed and make it big, or fail after a few years. By contrast, the Indian economy is exceedingly sticky. Good firms do not grow, and bad firms do not die. These two facts are probably closely related. The fact that good firms cannot grow fast enough also helps explain why bad firms can survive. If the best firms were to grow fast, they would drive down the price of whatever they sold, and therefore force out everyone except those efficient enough to make money even when the prices were low. By the same token, they would drive up wages and the cost of raw materials, further discouraging bad firms. In contrast, if they remain small and service only the local demand, a less efficient firm can easily survive in the market next door. One natural culprit is the capital market. It clearly plays a role in the Tirupur example, where the most productive entrepreneurs in the most productive T-shirt cluster in India cannot borrow enough to catch up in size with the less productive local firms. In India and China, estimates imply that simply reallocating capital across firms would erase most of the TFP gap created by misallocation. This interpretation dovetails with a generally shared sense that the banking sectors in both China and India have serious problems. Indian banks are famous for trying to avoid lending to anyone except blue-chip borrowers, usually without recognizing that yesterday's blue-chip firms are often today's disaster waiting to happen. Chinese banks have undergone significant reforms since the 1990s, with the goal of allowing for entry of different actors and improving the governance of the state-owned banks. But the big four state-owned banks still tend to be all too willing to lend to dubious projects with good political connections. Finding money remains difficult for a young and ambitious entrepreneur with a good idea but no powerful friends. Indian banks have very much the same problem, and in addition, they are reputedly extremely overstaffed. Overstaffing means they need to put a large wedge between the rate at which they lend to firms and the savings rate they offer to depositors if they want to break even. As a result, bank lending rates in India are high relative to the rest of the world, even though depositors earn very little interest. This also discourages investment by those who need to borrow to do so, and favors those with a rich relative to support them, like the Gounders of Tirupur. Bad banks hurt efficiency from both ends. Because of them, savings rates are lower than they could be, and savings are poorly managed. In addition, companies need risk capital, funding that, unlike bank funding, protects them when they are hit by bad luck. Stock markets do this, but the Chinese stock market is yet to be widely trusted, and the Indian one, while older and better run, is still very blue-chip dominated. Poorly developed land markets are another reason why companies do not grow. In order to grow, a productive firm will need to acquire more land and buildings to make room to accommodate new machines and employees. In addition, land and buildings can be used as collateral for loans. This becomes a huge problem when land markets function poorly. To take a very common example, in many countries, ownership of land and property is often disputed. A claims B's land, the land gets placed under court authority, and it typically takes years to settle the dispute. A recent study suggests that in India, land and buildings play a big role in misallocation. In fact, in about half the districts in India, more productive firms tend to have less land and buildings than the least productive ones. This is likely to be a large problem in many countries where property rights on land are not very clearly defined. One life to live. But there are other more psychological reasons why the best firms are not taking over India, Nigeria, or Mexico. Perhaps the owners like the idea of leaving their son a running business and prefer to avoid the risk of outside control that comes with outside financing. Raising money on the stock market, for example, requires setting up an independent board of directors who might get in the way of the succession plans. And perhaps ultimately, the owners do not care enough about growth to put all they have behind that agenda. If no one else is growing fast, they are not at risk of being pushed out. They have a reasonable living and a place to work. Why make it more stressful by trying to grow? A very interesting recent study looks at management gaps in Indian firms. By the norms of what the United States calls good management, firms in developing countries are terribly managed. One might dismiss this as prejudice against other ways of managing. Indians, in particular, are very proud of their way of doing business on a shoestring, what they call jugaad. This requires being inventive in using what you have, and perhaps this is what managers are doing. But managers are failing in ways that could not possibly make sense for them. For example, trash is allowed to accumulate on the shop floor, to the point that it becomes a fire hazard, or unused materials are bagged and thrown into an inventory room, but nobody labels or lists them, so it becomes virtually impossible to reuse them. When the researchers, one of them a former management consultant, sent, for free, a team of highly paid consultants to work for 5 months with the managers of a randomly chosen set of these firms, profits went up by $300,000 per firm, which even for these relatively large firms was not chicken feed. Moreover, most of the changes that made this happen were relatively simple things, like labeling inventories and removing trash. It is hard to see why the managers, if they wanted to raise profits, would need this rather expensive external help. The consulting would have cost them $250,000 had they paid for it. They undertake obvious changes if someone points them out and shames them into doing it, but not when left to themselves. It has to be that the owners ultimately don't feel strongly about doing the best they can possibly do. Waiting for forever. Companies also need labor. One might imagine this at least would not be a problem in a labor-abundant poor country, but it is actually not true. Even unskilled laborers in Odisha, one of India's poorest states, hold out for what they think is a fair wage, even if the alternative is not getting a job. Workers who accept a lower wage are punished by others. According to the nationally representative National Sample Survey, in 2009 and 2010, 26% of all Indian males between the ages of 20 and 30, with at least 10 years of education, were not working. This is not because there were no jobs. The fraction of those under 30 with less than 8 years of education who were not working was 1.3%. And in fact, the fraction of those with 10 years of education above 30 who were not working was about 2%. We see the same pattern in 1987, 1999, and 2009. So this is not because the young of today are less employable. There are plenty of jobs, just not jobs these young men want. They will eventually accept jobs they refused to take when they were younger, probably because the economic compulsions become stronger as they age. Their parents, who feed and house them now, will retire or pass on. They will want to get married. And the job options shrink. Government jobs, in particular, have an age cutoff that is often close to 30. Esther found something very similar in Ghana. A little over 10 years ago, about 2,000 adolescents were identified as having passed the hard exam necessary to qualify for higher secondary school in Ghana, corresponding roughly to grades 10 to 12, but had not enrolled in the first trimester for lack of funds. A third of them were randomly selected and offered a full scholarship for their entire time in secondary school. Before they were chosen for the scholarship, Esther and her co-authors asked their parents what they thought the economic benefit of enrolling in secondary school would be. The parents were generally optimistic. On average, they thought a person like their son or daughter could earn almost 4 times as much if they completed secondary school than if they did not start it. Moreover, they believed these gains would come because of greater access to government jobs, such as teaching and nursing. Not surprisingly, given these beliefs, 3/4 of the kids offered a scholarship jumped at the opportunity and completed secondary school, compared to only about half of the kids who did not get a scholarship. Esther and her colleagues have been following the progress of these adolescents ever since, interviewing them about once a year. They find many positives. The students learned useful things in school, and it changed their lives in many ways. They all performed better on a test that measures their ability to apply knowledge to concrete situations. Girls waited longer before starting a family and had fewer children. The not-so-good news is that the impact on their average earnings was not very large, except for the few who got a government job. The parents were right about one thing. Secondary education is indeed essential to get access to the college degrees that allow graduates to get coveted jobs. Secondary school graduates were indeed more likely to be teachers, to have other government jobs, or to have private jobs with benefits and fixed salaries. But where they got it wrong is that although secondary education is necessary, it is not sufficient. Secondary school scholarship winners, especially the girls, were more likely to go on to college, but the probability was still quite low, 16% among scholarship winners as against 12% in the comparison group, and only a few of them managed to get a government job. The scholarship doubled this probability, but it went from 3% to 6%. That is, from really, really small to really small. Meanwhile, though they were already 25 or 26, most of those who had gone to secondary school were still waiting for something better. A substantial fraction were not working at all. Only 70% of the kids in the sample, treatment and control combined, had earned anything in the last month. Intrigued by what these young people could be doing instead of working, we visited several of them. Steve, a young, affable, well-spoken man, received us in his home. He had graduated from secondary school over 2 years before, but had not worked since then. He was hoping to go to college and study politics, with the aim of being a radio anchor one day, but his grades on the admission test had been too low so far. He kept retaking it. In the meantime, he was living off his grandmother's pension. He saw no reason to let go of his dreams yet. He probably will eventually, but as he sees it, he's still young. The flip side of this is that even in countries with frighteningly high unemployment rates, like South Africa, where 54% of those between the ages of 15 and 24 say they are unemployed, companies complain they cannot get the workers they want. Workers with some education, a good attitude toward work, and a willingness to accept the wages on offer. In India, the government has invested an enormous amount of public resources on getting workers ready for the jobs the economy is generating. A couple of years ago, Abhijit collaborated with one of these businesses that does vocational training and job placement for the service sector. The company was worried they were not doing particularly well at placing their students. The data confirmed this. Out of 538 young men and women who signed up for a course, 450 completed it, Of those, 179 got job offers, and 99 accepted their offers, but after 6 months, only 58 were in the jobs the company had found for them, a hit rate of just over 10%. Another 12 were working elsewhere. What were they doing instead? We asked a group of those who had been offered a job but had either never taken it or quit more or less immediately. They were either taking what they called competitive exams to get a government job or a job in a quasi-governmental organization, like a public sector bank, or studying to complete their bachelor's degree and then apply for a government job, or just sitting at home, despite the fact that their families could ill afford that. Why did they not want the jobs they had been offered? We heard many answers, but it all came down to their not liking them. Too much work, too long hours, too much time spent standing, too much going from one place to another, too little pay. Part of the problem is a mismatch of expectations. The young men and women we interviewed in India grew up in families where post-primary education was still often a novelty. Their fathers had on average 8 years of schooling, their mothers less than 4. They were told that if they studied hard, they would get a good job, meaning mostly a desk job or a teaching job. This was closer to the truth in their parents' generation than it is today, especially for historically disadvantaged populations like the lower castes, who benefited from affirmative action. The growth in government jobs slowed and eventually stopped in the face of budgetary pressures, but the population of the educated, even among the historically disadvantaged, kept growing. In other words, the goalposts have moved. Something similar happened in countries like South Africa, and also in Egypt and other countries in the Middle East and North Africa, which were more developed than India to start with. There, it was not enough to have completed secondary school, but for a while having a bachelor's degree served the same screening function. If you could show your BA degree, you would walk into a government job. That is no longer true, but these countries are still producing millions of BAs in subjects like Arabic and political science, for which there is no market anymore. That today's graduates do not have the skills employers want is, of course, a constant complaint the world over, including in the United States. But the situation is quite extreme in those countries. The mismatch between reality and expectation is reinforced by the lack of exposure to the real labor market. With Sandra Sequeira, Abhijit evaluated a program in South Africa providing young workers in the townships, the erstwhile black ghettos of the apartheid era, with free transportation to look for jobs far from home. Those randomly chosen to get the transportation subsidy did travel a lot more, but there was no effect on employment. What did change, however, was their perception of the labor market. Almost everyone was too optimistic to start with. The salaries they expected to earn were 1.7 times higher than the actual salaries reported by employed workers similar to them. Being exposed to the actual labor market put a dampener on their expectations, and their wage expectations became closer to the truth. Labor markets frozen by this kind of radical mismatch are wasting resources. These young people are mostly waiting for jobs they will not get. In India, newspapers frequently write about the mad rush for government jobs. For example, that 28 million people applied for 90,000 low-level jobs in the government-owned railways. From the perspective of developing countries, some of these problems are purely self-inflicted. Part of the problem is that there are a small fraction of jobs that are much more attractive than the rest, for reasons having nothing to do with productivity. The best examples are government jobs. In the poorest countries, there is a large gap between the wages of public and private sector employees. In the poorest countries, public sector workers earn more than double the average wage in the private sector. And this is not counting generous health and pension benefits. This kind of difference can throw the entire labor market into a tailspin. If government sector jobs are so much more valuable than private sector jobs, but also very scarce, It is worthwhile for everybody to wait around and queue for those jobs. If the process of queuing and screening entails, as it often does, taking some exams, people may spend most of their working lives, or as much as they are allowed to by their families anyway, studying for those exams. If the government jobs stopped being quite so desirable, the economy would gain many years of productive labor, wasted in the pursuit of the mostly unattainable. Of course, government jobs are attractive in other countries as well, particularly because they often come with job security. But the wage gap is not quite as large and the queue not nearly as long. Cutting wages in government jobs would probably be a battle, but it would not be so difficult. For example, to limit the number of times people could apply for government jobs, or to make the age cutoff more stringent. This would avoid the massive waste of everyone waiting around. It could add an element of luck to the job allocation process, but it is not obvious that the resulting allocation would be worse than under the current system, which favors those who can afford to wait. In Ghana, while Steve was twiddling his thumbs, some other young graduates had had to find something to do because they had no one to subsidize their lifestyle. They did not lack imagination. We met a nut farmer, a DJ who specialized in funerals, a preacher in training, and 2 footballers on a minor league team. The labor market problems in developing countries are not, however, limited to the outsized attractiveness of the government sector. In Ghana, secondary school graduates are also attracted by a class of private jobs that offer benefits, high wages, and a measure of employment protection. In many developing countries, the labor markets feature this duality. There is a large informal sector without any protection, with many people who are self-employed for lack of better options, and a formal sector where employees are not only pampered, but also strongly protected. Some employment protection is of course necessary. Workers cannot be at the whim of their employer, but labor market regulations are so stringent that they really put a chokehold on any efficient reallocation of resources. Everyone was right. Everyone was wrong. Where does all of this leave us in our understanding of economic growth? Well, Robert Solow was right. Growth seems to slow down as countries get to a certain level of per capita income. At the technological frontier, that is to say, in the rich countries, TFP growth is largely a mystery. We do not know what propels it. And Robert Lucas and Paul Romer were right too. For the poorer countries, convergence is not automatic. This is probably not mainly because of spillovers. It is more that TFP is much lower in poorer countries, to a significant extent because of market failures. And therefore, to the extent that business-friendly institutions have something to do with fixing market failures, Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson were right too. And yet all of these economists were also wrong, because they thought of economic growth and of a country's resources as aggregate things, the labor force, the capital, the GDP, and in doing so, they probably missed the key point. Everything we have learned about misallocation tells us we have to step beyond the models and think of how the resources are used. If a country starts by using its resources very badly, like China did under communism, or India did in its days of extreme dirigism, then the first benefits of reform may come from moving resources to their best uses. Perhaps the reason why some countries, like China, can grow so fast for so long is that they start with a lot of poorly used talent and resources that can then be harnessed. This is neither Solow's nor Romer's world, in which a country would need either new resources or new ideas to grow. It might also suggest the growth would slow down rapidly once those wasted resources have all been put to good use, and growth becomes dependent on additional resources. Much is being written about the economic slowdown in China. Growth is definitely slowing down, and that is probably to be expected. This trend will almost surely continue, whatever Chinese leaders do now. China accumulated resources rapidly, as it had plenty of room to catch up. In the process, the most blatant sources of misallocation were eliminated, which means there is less room to improve now. The Chinese economy relied on exports to provide know-how, investment, and endless, for a while, global demand. But now they are the largest exporter in the world, so they cannot possibly continue to grow their exports much faster than the world is growing. China and the rest of the world will have to come to terms with the reality that their era of breathtaking growth is likely to come to an end. In terms of what is to come, it looks like the United States can relax a bit. In 1979, Harvard professor Ezra Vogel published a book, Japan as Number One, that predicted Japan would soon overtake all other countries to become the number one economic superpower. Western countries, he argued, needed to learn from the Japanese model. Good labor relations, low crime, excellent schools, and elite bureaucrats with long-time horizons was the new recipe Vogel identified for permanently faster growth. Indeed, had it continued to grow at its average growth rate over the decade 1963 to 1973, Japan would have overtaken the United States in terms of GDP per capita by 1985, and in overall GDP by 1998. It did not happen. What happened instead is enough to make one superstitious. The growth rate crashed in 1980, the year after Vogel's book came out, and it never really recovered. The Solow model suggests a simple reason. Due to a low fertility rate and the near-complete absence of immigration, Japan was, and still is, aging rapidly. The working-age population peaked in the late 1990s and has been declining. This means TFP must grow all the more rapidly to keep fast growth going. Another way to say this is that Japan would have to find some miracle for its existing labor force to become more productive, since we still have no reliable way to boost TFP. In the euphoria of the 1970s, some believed this to be possible, which may explain why people continued to save and invest in Japan in the 1980s despite the slowdown. Too much good money chased too few good projects in the so-called bubble economy of the 1980s, with the consequence that banks ended up with many bad loans and a huge crisis in the 1990s. China faces some of the same problems. It is aging fast, partly as a result of the one-child policy, which has proven difficult to reverse. It might still eventually catch up with the United States in per capita terms, but the slowing growth means it will take quite a while. If China slows to 5% per year, which is not implausible, and stays there, which is perhaps optimistic, and the United States continues to bounce around 1.5%, it will take at least 35 years for China to catch up with the U.S. in terms of per capita income. Meanwhile, the Chinese authorities may also want to relax and accept the writ of Solow. Growth will slow. They are aware of it, and have made a conscious attempt to alert the Chinese people to this fact. But the growth targets they have set may still be too high. The danger is that it could put the leadership in a bind and lead them to make bad decisions in an effort to make growth come back, as Japan did before them. If a fundamental driver of economic growth is resource misallocation, it opens the door to various unorthodox strategies to make growth happen. Such strategies are meant to respond to the particular way in which resource use in a country is distorted. The Chinese and South Korean governments did a good job of identifying sectors that were too small and therefore not meeting the economy's needs. They tended to be heavy industry, providing basic raw materials to other industries like steel and chemicals, and directed capital toward them through state investments and other interventions. This might have sped up the transition to efficient resource use. That it worked in those two countries does not necessarily mean it is something every country should emulate. Economists tend to be very wary of industrial policy for good reasons. The history of state-directed investments is not one that inspires confidence, Judgments are frequently bad, even when they are not actually deliberately distorted to benefit someone or some group, which is often. These are government failures, just as there are market failures, and there are so many instances of these that it would be very dangerous to blindly rely on governments to pick the winners. But there are also so many market failures that it makes no sense either to rely on the market alone to allocate resources to the right use. We need an industrial policy designed that keeps in mind these political constraints. Another implication of the idea that growth is slowed down by misallocation is that countries like India that are growing fast right now should fear complacency. It is relatively easy to grow fast, starting from a spectacularly messed up economy, because of the gains from better resource use. In Indian manufacturing, there was a sharp acceleration in technology upgrading at the plant level and some reallocation toward the best firms within each industry after 2002. This appears to be unrelated to any economic policy and is described as India's mysterious manufacturing miracle. But it is no miracle. At its root, it is a modest improvement from a dismal starting point, and one can imagine various reasons it happened. Perhaps a generational shift, as control passed from the parents to their children, often educated abroad, more ambitious, and savvier about technology and world markets. Or the effect of the accumulation of modest profits that eventually made it possible to pay for the shift to bigger and better plants. But as the economy sheds its worst plants and firms, the space for further improvement naturally shrinks. Growth in India, like that in China, will slow, and there is no guarantee it will slow when India has reached the same level of per capita income as China. When China was at the same level of per capita GDP as India is today, it was growing at 12% per year, whereas India thinks of 8% as something to aspire to. If we were to extrapolate from that, India will plateau at a much lower level of per capita GDP than China. The growth tide does raise all boats, but it doesn't lift all boats to the same level. Many economists worry that there may be such a thing as the middle income trap, an intermediate-level GDP where countries get stuck or nearly stuck. According to the World Bank, of 101 middle-income economies in 1960, only 13 had become high-income by 2008. Malaysia, Thailand, Egypt, Mexico, and Peru all seem to have trouble moving up. Of course, there are many pitfalls in any such extrapolation, and India should treat it as what it is, no more than a warning. It is quite possible that India's growth, in spite of all its problems, has very little to do with some special Indian genius. Instead, it has a lot to do with the flip side of misallocation, the opportunities of being an economy with a large pool of potential entrepreneurs to draw upon, and lots of unexploited opportunities. Chasing the growth mirage. If this is the right story, India should start to worry about what happens when those opportunities begin to run out. Unfortunately, just as we don't know much about how to make growth happen, we know very little about why some countries get stuck but others don't, why South Korea kept growing but Mexico did not, or how one gets out. One very real danger is that in trying to hold on to fast growth, India and other countries facing sharply slowing growth will veer toward policies that hurt the poor now in the name of future growth. The need to be business-friendly to preserve growth may be interpreted, as it was in the U.S. and U.K. in the Reagan-Thatcher era, as open season for all kinds of anti-poor, pro-rich policies, such as bailouts for over-indebted corporations and wealthy individuals, that enrich the top earners at the cost of everyone else and do nothing for growth. If the U.S. and U.K. experience is any guide, asking the poor to tighten their belts in the hope that giveaways to the rich will eventually trickle down does nothing for growth and even less for the poor. If anything, the explosion of inequality in an economy no longer growing has the risk of being very bad news for growth because the political backlash leads to the election of populist leaders touting miracle solutions that rarely work and often lead to Venezuela-style disasters. Interestingly, even the IMF, so long the bastion of growth-first orthodoxy, now recognizes that sacrificing the poor to promote growth was bad policy. It now requires its country teams to include inequality in factors to take into consideration when providing policy guidance to countries and outlining conditions under which they can receive IMF assistance. The key, ultimately, is to not lose sight of the fact that GDP is a means and not an end. A useful means, no doubt, especially when it creates jobs or raises wages or plumps the government budget so it can redistribute more. But the ultimate goal remains one of raising the quality of life of the average person, and especially the worst-off person. And quality of life means more than just consumption. As we saw in the previous chapter, most human beings care about feeling worthy and respected. They suffer when they feel they are failing themselves and their families. While better lives are indeed partly about being able to consume more, even very poor people also care about the health of their parents, about educating their children, about having their voices heard, and about being able to pursue their dreams. A higher GDP may be one way in which this can be given to the poor, but it is only one of the ways, and there is no presumption that it is always the best one. In fact, the quality of life varies enormously between middle-income countries. For example, Sri Lanka has more or less the same GDP per capita as Guatemala, but maternal, infant, and child mortality are much lower in Sri Lanka, and are comparable with those in the United States. Delivering well-being. More generally, looking back, it is quite clear that many of the important successes of the last few decades were the direct result of a policy focus on those particular outcomes, even in some countries that were and have remained very poor. For example, a massive reduction in under-5 mortality took place even in some very poor countries that were not growing particularly fast, largely thanks to a focus on newborn care, vaccination, and malaria prevention. And it is no different with many of the other levers for fighting poverty, be it education, skills, entrepreneurship, or health. We need a focus on the key problems and an understanding of what works to address them. This is patient work. Spending money by itself does not necessarily deliver real education or good health. But the good news is that by contrast to growth, we know how to make progress here. One big advantage of focusing on clearly defined interventions is that these policies have measurable objectives and therefore can be directly evaluated. We can experiment with them, abandon the ones that do not work, and improve the ones with potential. The recent history of malaria is a good example. Malaria is one of the biggest killers of small children, and a disease preventable by avoiding mosquito bites. Since the 1980s, the number of malaria deaths had been rising every year. At the peak, in 2004, there were 1.8 million deaths from malaria. Then, in 2005, there was a dramatic turning point. Between 2005 and 2016, the number of deaths from malaria declined by 75%. Many factors probably contributed to the decrease in the number of malaria deaths, but the widespread distribution of insecticide-treated bed nets almost surely played a key role. Overall, the benefits of nets are well established. In 2004, a review of the evidence from 22 carefully done randomized controlled trials found that, on average, 1,000 more nets distributed contributed to a reduction of 5.5 deaths per year. As we described in Poor Economics, however, there was a big debate at the time on whether nets should be sold to beneficiaries at a subsidized price, or given for free. But an RCT by Pascaline Dupas and Jessica Cohen, replicated since then by several other studies, established that free nets are in fact used just as much as nets that are paid for, and free distribution achieves a much higher effective coverage than cost sharing. Since Poor Economics was published in 2011, this evidence eventually convinced the key players that massive distribution was the most effective way to fight malaria. Between 2014 and 2016, a total of 582 million insecticide-treated mosquito nets were delivered globally. Of these, 505 million were delivered in sub-Saharan Africa, and 75% were distributed through mass distribution campaigns of free bed nets. The magazine Nature concluded that insecticide-treated net distributions averted 450 million malaria deaths between 2000 and 2015. The accumulation of evidence took some time, but it worked. Even the skeptics were convinced. Bill Easterly, who in 2011 was an outspoken critic of free bed net distribution, gracefully acknowledged in a tweet that his nemesis, Jeff Sachs, was more right than he was on this particular issue. The right policy choices were made, leading to tremendous progress against a terrible scourge. The bottom line is that despite the best efforts of generations of economists, the deep mechanisms of persistent economic growth remain elusive. No one knows if growth will pick up again in rich countries, or what to do to make it more likely. The good news is that we do have things to do in the meantime. There is a lot that both poor and rich countries could do to get rid of the most egregious sources of waste in their economies. While these things may not propel countries to permanently faster growth, they could dramatically improve the welfare of their citizens. Moreover, while we do not know when the growth locomotive will start, if and when it does, the poor will be more likely to hop onto that train if they are in decent health, can read and write, and can think beyond their immediate circumstances. It may not be an accident that many of the winners of globalization were ex-communist countries that had invested heavily in the human capital of their populations in the communist years, China and Vietnam, or countries threatened with communism that had pursued similar policies for that reason, Taiwan, South Korea. The best bet, therefore, for a country like India is to attempt to do things that can make the quality of life better for its citizens with the resources it already has. Improving education, health, and the functioning of the courts and the banks, and building better infrastructure, better roads and more livable cities, for example. For the world of policymakers, this perspective suggests that a clear focus on the well-being of the poorest offers the possibility of transforming millions of lives much more profoundly than we could by finding the recipe to increase growth from 2% to 2.3% in the rich countries. In the coming chapters, we will go one step further and argue that it may even be better for the world if we did not find that recipe. Chapter 6. In Hot Water. In 2019, it is impossible to think about economic growth without confronting its most immediate implication. We already know that over the next 100 years, the Earth will become warmer. The question is, by just how much? The costs of climate change would be quite different if the planet got warmer by 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius or more. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, October 2018 report, at 1.5 degrees Celsius, 70% of coral reefs would vanish. At 2 degrees Celsius, 99%. The number of people directly impacted by the rise in sea levels and the transformation of cultivable land into desert would also be quite different under the two scenarios. The overwhelming scientific consensus is that human activity is responsible for climate change, and the only way to stay on a course to avoid catastrophe is to reduce carbon emissions. Under the 2015 Paris Agreement, nations set a target to limit warming to a limit of 2 degrees Celsius, with a more ambitious target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Based on the scientific evidence, the IPCC report concludes that in order to limit warming to 2 degrees Celsius, CO2 equivalent, CO2e emissions, would need to be reduced by 25% by 2030 compared to the 2010 level, and go to zero by 2070. To reach 1.5 degrees Celsius, CO2e emissions would need to go down by 45% by 2030 and to zero by 2050. Climate change is massively inequitable. The lion's share of CO2e emissions are being generated either in rich countries or to produce what people consume in rich countries. But the greatest share of the cost is and will be experienced in poor countries. Does it make it an intractable problem, given that those who must solve it have no strong impetus to do so? Or is there some hope? The 50-10 Rule. The IPCC report details everything that would have to be done to cut emissions and limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Some steps could already be taken. Switching to electric cars, constructing zero-emissions buildings, building more trains would all help. But the bottom line is that even with technological improvements, and even if we could wean ourselves off coal entirely, without any movement toward more sustainable consumption, any future economic growth will have a large direct impact on climate change. This is because as consumption rises, we need energy to produce all the things that are consumed. We generate CO2 emissions not only when we drive our cars, but also when we leave them in our garages, since energy was used in producing the car and the garage. That is true even for electric cars. There are many studies that attempt to look at the relationship between income and carbon emissions. The answer varies with climate, family size, and so on, but the two always track each other closely. The average estimate implies that when your income increases by 10%, your CO2 emissions increase by 9%. This implies that, although Europe and the United States are responsible for a large share of global emissions to date, today's emerging economies, particularly China, are generating an ever-growing share of current emissions. In fact, China is the single largest emitter of carbon. This is, however, largely due to goods produced in China but consumed elsewhere in the world. If we attribute the emissions to where the consumption takes place, North Americans consume 22.5 tons of CO2e per year per person. Western Europeans, 13.1, Chinese, 6, and South Asians, just 2.2. Within developing countries, richer people also consume a lot more CO2 than the poor. The richest people in India and China belong to the select group at the top 10% of the most polluting people in the world and contribute, respectively, 1% and 10% to the emissions of this group, or 0.45% and 4.5% of world emissions. In contrast, the poorest 7% of the population in India emit just 0.15 tons of CO2 per year per person. Overall, we get the 50-10 rule. 10% of the world's population, the highest polluters, contribute roughly 50% of CO2 emissions, while 50% who pollute the least contribute just over 10%. The citizens of rich countries, and more generally the rich worldwide, bear an overwhelming responsibility for any future climate change. Bathing in the Baltic. On a June day sometime in the early 1990s, encouraged by his friend and fellow economist Jürgen Webel, Abhijit went swimming in the Baltic. He leaped in and instantly jumped out. He claims that his teeth continued to chatter for the next 3 days. In 2018, also in June, We went to the Baltic and Stockholm, several hundred miles farther north than the previous encounter. This time it was literally child's play. Our children frolicked in the water. Wherever we went in Sweden, the unusually warm weather was a topic of conversation. It was probably a portent of something everyone felt, but for the moment, it was hard not to be quite delighted with the new opportunities for outdoor life it offered. It is in the poor countries that there is no such ambivalence. If the earth warms a degree centigrade or two, residents of North Dakota will mostly feel perfectly happy about it. Residents of Dallas, perhaps a bit less. Residents of Delhi and Dhaka will experience more days that are unbearably hot. As just one example, between 1957 and 2000, India experienced on average 5 days per year with an average daily temperature above 35 degrees Celsius. Without a global climate policy, it is projected to have 75 such days by the end of the century. The typical U.S. resident will experience just 26. The problem is that poorer countries tend to be closer to the equator, and that is where the real pain will be felt. To make matters worse, the residents of poor countries are less equipped to protect themselves against the potential bad effects of hot temperatures. They lack air conditioning because they are poor, and they work in agriculture, on construction sites, or on brick kilns where air conditioning is not really an option. What are the likely impacts of the temperature increases that are going to come with climate change on life in these countries? We cannot just compare warmer and colder places to answer this, since these places are also different in 100 other ways. What allows us to say something about the potential impact of temperature change is that the temperature at a particular location fluctuates on a given calendar day from year to year. There are years with especially hot summers, years with particularly cold winters, and nice years when both winters and summers are temperate. The environmental economist Michael Greenstone pioneered the idea of using these year-to-year weather fluctuations to get some understanding of the impact of future climate change. For example, if it was especially hot in one district in India in a particular year, was agricultural production lower in that year compared to the same district in other years, or to other districts where it was not so hot? There are various reasons to not trust this particular approach blindly. Permanent climate differences will surely spur innovations to limit their impact. We won't pick these up in the effects of year-to-year changes because innovation takes time. On the other hand, permanent changes may have other costs that don't occur when the change is temporary, such as the draining of the water table. In other words, those estimates could be too small or too large. But as long as the bias in the estimate is the same for rich and poor countries, it is still useful to compare the predictions we get. The general conclusion is that the damage from climate change will be much more serious in poor countries. There will be losses in U.S. agriculture, but the losses in India, Mexico, and Africa will be much larger. In some parts of Europe, such as in the vineyards of the Moselle Valley, there will be more sun warming the vines, and both the quality and quantity of Moselle wine are predicted to increase. The effect of hot weather on productivity is not limited to agriculture. People are less productive when it is hot, particularly if they have to work outside. For example, evidence from the United States suggests that at temperatures over 38 degrees Celsius, labor supply in outdoor jobs drops by as much as 1 hour per day compared to temperatures in the 24 degrees Celsius to 26 degrees Celsius range. There are no statistically detectable effects in industries that are not exposed to climate, for example, non-manufacturing indoor activities. Children have lower test scores at the end of particularly hot school years. These effects are absent where schools have air conditioning, so they affect poorer children the most. In India, few factories have air conditioning. In a garment factory in India, a study looked at how labor productivity varied with temperature. For temperatures below 27 to 28 degrees Celsius, Temperature had a very small impact on efficiency, but for mean daily temperatures above this cutoff, about 1/4 of production days, efficiency went down by 2% for every 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature. Putting everything together across the entire world, a study finds that it being 1 degree Celsius warmer in a given year reduces per capita income by 1.4%, but only in poor countries. And, of course, the consequences of a warmer climate are not limited to income. Numerous studies emphasize the danger of hot temperatures for health. In the United States, an additional day of extreme heat, exceeding 32 degrees Celsius, relative to a moderately cool day, 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, raises the annual age-adjusted mortality rate by about 0.11%. In India, the effect is 25 times larger. Lifesaver. The United States experience also illustrates how being richer and more technologically advanced can help mitigate temperature risks. In the United States, the estimates of the mortality impacts of high temperatures in the 1920s and 1930s were 6 times larger than the estimates for the current period. The difference may be entirely due to the much greater access to air conditioning, a key mechanism through which residents of rich countries adapt to higher temperatures. This explains why, in hot years, energy demand goes up massively in rich countries. In poor countries, where air conditioning is still rare, in 2011, 87% of households in the United States had air conditioning, but only 5% of Indians did, we see larger reductions in productivity and increases in mortality when temperatures go up. In these places, air conditioning could be a critical adaptation tool. It should not be a luxury, but it is. As poor countries become richer, they will be able to afford more air conditioning. Between 1995 and 2009, the ratio of air conditioning units to homes in urban China went from 8% to over 100%, meaning there was more than one AC unit per urban household. But air conditioning itself aggravates global warming. The hydrofluorocarbon, HFC gases used in standard air conditioning appliances have particularly deleterious impacts on the climate. They are much more dangerous than CO2. This puts us in a rather difficult situation. The very technology that can help to protect people from climate change also accelerates the rate of climate change. Newly available air conditioners that do not use HFC pollute less, but at the moment they are much more expensive. A country like India, which is on the cusp of being able to afford the cheaper air conditioning appliances, thus faces a particularly ghastly trade-off: saving lives today or moderating climate change to save lives in the future. An agreement reached in Kigali, Rwanda, in October 2016, after years of negotiation, illustrates how the world navigates this trade-off when it does manage to navigate it. The Kigali Agreement created 3 tracks. Rich countries, including the United States, Japan, and Europe, will start phasing out synthetic HFCs in 2019. China and 100 other developing countries in 2024, and a small group of countries, including India, Pakistan, and some Gulf states, will postpone the start date until 2028. While realizing its citizens are both the victims and the cause of global warming, the Indian government took the stance that they prefer to save lives today rather than tackle the problem right now. They are probably banking on the fact that economic growth in the intervening years will put them in a position to afford the more expensive devices, which may also have become cheaper in the meantime by 2028. But during those 10 years, there could be a very rapid spread of old-style appliances in India, especially since the makers of the HFC-based machines will want an outlet for their products, and these will stay operational and continue to pollute for years after 2028. This delay could turn out to be quite costly for the planet. Act now The air conditioning conundrum is a particularly heart-wrenching illustration of the trade-off India feels it is facing between the present and the future. More generally, until the Paris Agreement in 2015, India had simply refused to contemplate limits on its own emissions, arguing that it could not afford to hinder its own economic growth, and rich countries should bear the brunt of the adjustment. The pollution evolved when India ratified the Paris Agreement and came up with a concrete commitment, asking in exchange for some serious financial aid to afford the energy transition, to be financed from an international fund paid for by the rich countries. Although Indian emissions are not a large fraction of world emissions today, India will be a key player moving forward, as its growing middle class consumes more and more. And unlike the United States, a large part of its population will also be directly and severely affected by climate change, so it should be in a good place to understand the costs of today's choices. Its reluctance to act is thus deeply concerning, not only because it has direct impacts, but because it illustrates the dominance of short-term thinking among politicians. The key question is whether the trade-off is as stark as the Indians, or the Americans for that matter, seem to believe it is. Do we really have to give up something today? Perhaps we can have our cake and eat it too, if we develop and switch to better technologies that will allow us to curb warming without giving up much by way of our lifestyles. After all, just a few years ago, energy experts were sternly telling us that renewable energy sources, solar and wind, were simply too expensive, and it was foolish to invest in them as an alternative to fossil fuel. They are considerably cheaper today, notably due to technological progress in those sectors. Energy efficiency has also considerably improved and could improve more. In 2006, the UK government commissioned the former chief economist of the World Bank, Lord Nicholas Stern, to prepare a report on the economic implications of climate change. The Stern Review optimistically concludes, "Yet despite the historical pattern and the business-as-usual projections, the world does not need to choose between averting climate change and promoting growth and development. Changes in energy technologies and the structure of economies have reduced the responsiveness of emissions to income growth, particularly in some of the richest countries. With strong, deliberate policy choices, it is possible to decarbonize both developed and developing economies on the scale required for climate stabilization while maintaining economic growth in both." Amen to this. Still, it would not quite be free. The Stern Report concludes that, assuming a rate of technological progress in the green sector based on extrapolating from recent history, it would cost about 1% of world GDP annually to stabilize emissions at the level necessary to stave off global warming. But that seems a modest cost to avoid endangering the future of the world as we know it. One hope is that research and development efforts might respond to incentives. R&D expenditures are strongly influenced by the size of the market for the new innovations they are seeking to finance. So, a temporary inducement to research clean alternatives to dirty technologies in the form of a carbon tax that would make it more expensive to use the old technologies, and/or direct subsidies to research clean technologies, could have a snowball effect by creating a demand. The clean technology would become cheaper, and therefore more attractive, which would increase the demand for it and hence the returns to research. Eventually, the clean sector would be attractive enough to root out the dirty sector, and we would be home free. Our little economic engine could be back on its balanced path with the same growth as before, fueled by wind, water, and the sun. We could even stop all taxes and subsidies to encourage clean energy after a while. It is easy to see how it could work. It is also frighteningly easy to see how it could not work. After all, the dirty technology would still be there. If fewer people used coal and oil, the prices of these inputs would plummet. This would make it very tempting to go back to using them. It is true that because coal and oil are not renewable means their prices will tend to go up over time as the supplies run down, but there is probably enough coal and oil under the ground to take us to Armageddon. It is hard to be entirely sanguine. Free lunch? What the optimists are hoping for is that ultimately there will be a free lunch. Firms and people will save money by adopting the cleaner technologies because research will have made them so much cheaper. Adopting clean technologies would be a win for individuals and a win for the planet. The prospect of a free lunch is always enticing. In fact, it is so enticing that it tends to dominate the climate change conversation. Detailed engineering estimates routinely predict investments that enhance energy efficiency and pay for themselves in the form of a smaller energy bill. A 2009 McKinsey report, Unlocking Energy Efficiency in the U.S. Economy, attracted a lot of attention. The report estimated that a holistic approach of investment in energy efficiency would yield gross energy savings worth more than $1.2 trillion, well above the $520 billion needed through 2020 for upfront investment in efficiency measures. In 2013, the International Energy Administration calculated that energy efficiency measures alone could give us 49% of the reduction in CO2e emissions we need without any other change. If that is the case, then perhaps we have a relatively easy problem to solve. All we need to do is to bridge this energy efficiency gap. We need to identify the barriers preventing consumers and corporations from undertaking these investments. Perhaps they don't know. Perhaps they cannot get a loan to finance the upfront costs. Perhaps they are myopic. Or perhaps they suffer from inertia. Unfortunately, when one looks at the on-the-ground performance of those supposedly low-hanging fruits, rather than predictions of engineering models, there is less good news. The Federal Weatherization Assistance Program, WAP, is the largest energy efficiency program for home users in the United States. It has covered 7 million households in the U.S. since its inception in 1976. Michael Greenstone and a team of economists got a chance to allocate an offer to participate in the program to about 7,500 households, randomly chosen out of 30,000 in Michigan. The winners were offered over $5,000 in weatherization investments, insulation, window replacements, etc., at no out-of-pocket cost. The researchers then collected data on winners and losers. The RCT produced 3 main findings. First, the demand for the program was really low. Despite an aggressive and costly encouragement campaign, only 6% of households in the treatment group eventually took up the offer. Second, the energy use gains were real. The energy bill went down by 10 to 20% for those who took the program up, but were only a third of what was predicted by the engineering estimates, and much lower than the upfront costs. Third, this is not because households reacted to the prospect of a lower energy bill by heating their houses more, the so-called rebound effect. They found no increase in home temperatures. The engineering estimates apparently did not fully apply to real houses in real places. They were much too optimistic. The gap between the rosy engineering estimates and the truth does not just apply to households. A researcher teamed up with the Department of Climate Change and the government of Gujarat, one of the most industrialized and most polluted states in India, to provide small and medium firms with high-quality energy efficiency consulting. A random sample of firms received a free energy audit, which gave each firm a list of approved energy efficiency-enhancing investments the state could heavily subsidize under a pre-existing program. Then, a random subset of the firms that got the audits received regular visits from energy consultants to facilitate the adoption. The audits on their own had a limited impact on the adoption of the new technologies. The consulting led to more adoption, but it also changed what firms were doing. They started producing more, which increased their energy demand. Overall, there was no effect on energy consumption, this time because of the rebound effect. Again, the engineers who calculated the potential emissions gains from technologies that saved energy were too optimistic in their predictions. Our sense is that there may not be that many free lunches. Mitigation through better technologies may not do the trick. People's consumption will need to fall. We may have to be content not only with cleaner cars, but also with smaller cars or no cars at all. The Greenpeace answer. This is not what our colleagues in economics like to hear. First, because of economists' ongoing love affair with material consumption as a marker of well-being, and second, because they are suspicious of attempts to change behavior, especially when changing preferences is involved. Many economists have a philosophical objection to manipulating preferences. The reason for this reluctance is the economists' long-standing belief that there is something true about people's preferences, and that their actions reflect deep-seated desires. Any attempt to convince people to do something different, such as consume less or consume differently, would then encroach on those preferences. But as we saw in Chapter 4, there are really no such things as true, well-defined preferences. If people don't know how they feel about something as quotidian as a box of chocolates or a bottle of wine, why do we expect them to have clear preferences about climate change? Or what kind of world their grandchildren should live in? Or whether the people of the Maldives deserve to have their islands washed away by a rising sea, and to know how much they are willing to alter their own lifestyles to prevent those disasters. Economists typically assume most people would not voluntarily sacrifice anything to affect the lives of unborn people or those who live very far away. But this is probably not true, for example, of you, the listener, or you would have turned off this audiobook a long time ago. Or, for that matter, of most economists themselves. Many of us probably do care about a whole range of outcomes that don't affect us directly, even if we have a hard time assigning money values to them. The reason this is important is that it changes the way we should think about policy interventions. If everyone has well-defined preferences and acts on them, for example, they don't care at all about the damage to other people, the ideal environmental policy is one that sets a price for damaging the environment, but otherwise lets the market do its job. This is the idea behind the carbon tax, which is something most economists, including us, have now embraced. It was key to the work of William Nordhaus, who was rewarded with the Nobel Prize in 2018. Having to pay an explicit price for polluting is certainly something firms take seriously. Allowing firms to buy the right to pollute from other firms that are actually actively reducing pollution, the idea of tradable carbon credits, may also be a good idea because it creates incentives for non-polluting firms to find ways to actively unpollute, say by planting trees. And the revenues from taxes on polluters is useful because we need to pay for new environment-friendly technologies. But there is a strong case for going beyond carbon credits. Take someone who thinks of themselves as having a strong commitment to fighting climate change, but ends up never buying energy-efficient LED light bulbs. The reason could be that he does not know about LEDs, or that he forgets to buy them when he goes to the shop, or that he cannot make up his mind about just how much a premium he is willing to pay for the LEDs, because he has a hard time putting a number on how much he really cares about preventing climate change. Would such a person be better or worse off if the government banned non-LED bulbs? Or, if bans seem too extreme, the government could nudge people gently toward choices that are better for the environment. For example, smart meters now afford the possibility of charging higher prices for electricity during peak hours, compensated by lower prices the rest of the time. This would be better for the environment. A recent study in Sacramento, California, found that only 20% of users actively chose such plans when they were made available. And yet, when a plan like this was made the default for randomly chosen users, who then had the option of switching back to the traditional plan, 90% of them stayed on it, and those who stayed indeed used less energy. What did they truly prefer then? The option they actively chose, or the one they did not choose but were willing to stick to? A government may decide that since there is no clear answer to this question, it may as well go with the one better for the environment. A larger open question is the extent to which energy consumption is a matter of habit. A particular way of consuming could become almost like an addiction simply because this is what people are used to. At the Paris School of Economics, the new green building provides very little heating. When we worked there, we were always cold in the winter and spring and complained regularly about it. But somehow, the simple tactic of leaving a thick sweater in the office eluded us for many months. Yet, it was really not so difficult. We just were suffering from many years of overheated American offices, and once we had managed to transport the sweater, we did not feel worse off than we would have had the building been warmer. The moral brownie points from doing our bit to save the planet was enough compensation. Many of the behaviors that influence energy consumption are repeated and habitual: taking the train rather than the car, turning off the lights when leaving a room, and so on. For such behaviors, doing what we have always done in the past is easiest. Changes are costly. But once we switch, it is easy to keep going. Even more mechanically, if we buy a thermostat, we can set it up once and for all to heat more in the morning and at night, and less when we are away. This means today's energy choices also affect future energy consumption. Indeed, there is direct evidence that energy choices are persistent. In an RCT, some randomly chosen households received regular energy reports telling them how much energy they were using relative to their neighbors. The report recipients began to consume less energy than the households that never got them, even after the reports stopped. And this seems largely a result of changes in their habits. If energy consumption is a bit like an addiction, in that using a lot of energy today makes us use a lot in the future, then the appropriate response is high taxes, like those on cigarettes. High taxes would discourage the behavior initially, and then, once the proper behavior was learned, the taxes could continue to be high without really hurting anyone, since everyone had changed their habits in order to avoid them. Of course, our energy consumption is not only caused by how we heat, cool, or transport ourselves. Everything we purchase contributes to it. There again, tastes probably do not fall from the sky. Economists have begun to recognize the role of habits in our preferences. What we grew up consuming forms our tastes today. Migrants continue to eat what they grew up eating, even when the food that was cheap in their home country is expensive in their new country. Habits mean it is painful in the short run to change your behavior. But they can be changed. People even seem willing to modify their behavior in order to get ready for some future change. Thus, announcing a future tax hike on goods gobbling up energy could be an easier way for people to get used to the idea. Pollution kills. Rich countries have the enormous advantage in that much of the energy consumption they need to sacrifice is inessential. Driving to the supermarket when you could walk, sticking to your old bulbs instead of switching to LEDs, etc. Where the rubber really hits the road is in the developing world. In the last 2 decades, coal consumption has trebled in India and quadrupled in China, while declining slightly in the United States and other developed countries. In the decades to come, growth in the energy consumption is forecast to be 4 times higher outside the OECD than within. But for most Indians, additional consumption, and additional energy consumption in particular, is not a luxury. The very low energy consumption in rural India today is due to a mode of existence that is often unpleasant and dangerous. They cannot possibly use less, and ought to have a right to use more. In that case, is there a rationale for poor countries to stay completely outside of the climate conversation? Or, at a minimum, to limit any sacrifice to their richest citizens, who have the lifestyles and the emissions of rich Americans? It is hard to say no. There is certainly something deeply unfair about the world's poor paying for the past and present indulgence of the world's rich. Unfortunately, there are two problems with taking this position. The first, which we already discussed, is that the consequences of a temporary let-off for the developing world may encourage many years of life for the world's most polluting technologies. The temporary let-off may not be that temporary. Most victims will be in the developing world, so people in the developed world may be all too happy to go along with that. But second, the real crux of the issue is whether the developing world can afford to continue at its current pollution levels, or grow them, even without the threat of global warming. CO2e emissions are strongly correlated with something else that directly affects their citizens today: air pollution. The environment in China and India has degraded so fast that pollution has become a massive and urgent public health hazard, and it is also becoming worse in other emerging economies. This pollution kills. In China, coal-fired indoor heating is subsidized on the north side of the River Huai, but not on the south, on the grounds that it is colder in the north. One can see a precipitous drop in the quality of the air when crossing the river from south to north. Correspondingly, there is a similar drop in life expectancy. Estimates imply that moving China to the worldwide standard for the concentration of particulate matter in the air would save the equivalent of 3.7 billion years of life. China's skies are, however, positively pristine compared to those of many big Indian cities. Several Indian cities, including the capital New Delhi, top the list of most air-polluted cities on Earth. In November 2017, the Chief Minister of Delhi compared the city to a gas chamber. According to the U.S. Embassy's measurements, at that time the air in New Delhi reached pollution levels 48 times the guideline value established by the World Health Organization. As in China, this level of pollution is undoubtedly deadly. Admissions to hospitals surge every November when pollution skyrockets. Globally, the Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health estimates that 9 million premature deaths were caused by air pollution in 2015. More than 2.5 million of those deaths were in India, the most in any single country. Pollution in Delhi in the winter is due to a combination of several factors, including pure geographical bad luck, but some of it is due to behaviors that could be changed. One important pollutant comes from burning the stubble left after crop cutting in states neighboring Delhi. The smoke from the burning outside the city is then mixed with various pollutants produced inside the city: dust from construction, exhaust from vehicles, residue from the burning of trash and the open fires the poor use to cook and keep warm in winter. The smog in Delhi is so bad, there is a clear impetus to act immediately. There is no trade-off between the quality of life today and in the future, since people are dying now. The only trade-off is between consuming less or choking. And even this trade-off may be mostly illusory. Two different studies, one involving workers in a textile manufacturing firm in India and one on travel agents in China, have shown that on days when ambient pollution is high, productivity is low. So, more pollution may mean less consumption. Delhi is a relatively rich city. City dwellers can easily afford to pay the farmers not to burn their crops, and to instead use machines to bury them and ready the soil for the next planting. The government could ban open fires in the city and create heated rooms where the poor could gather on cold nights. It could replace trash burning with a more modern trash collection and treatment system. It could ban old cars, or in fact ban diesel-fueled cars altogether, and introduce congestion pricing or another form of congestion management. It could enforce more vigorously the tough industrial pollution standards on the books, but not typically respected. It could improve the public transportation system. It could shut down or upgrade the large thermal plants operating within the city. Perhaps none of these would be sufficient individually, but combined they would surely improve the situation. None of this is out of reach. For example, a Friends of the Court brief submitted to India's Supreme Court suggested that a subsidy of 20 billion rupees, about $300 million, would be enough for the farmers of Punjab and Haryana to purchase the equipment needed to prepare their fields. This is only approximately 1,000 rupees, $14 at the current exchange rate, a little over $70 at PPP per inhabitant of Greater Delhi. Surprisingly and frustratingly, despite the urgency of the bad air, the political demand for such a response is not overwhelming. Part of the problem may be that curbing pollution would require a lot of people to cooperate. But there is also a lack of awareness that air pollution is a health issue. A recent Lancet study found that a large part of the deaths due to outdoor air pollution can be attributed to the burning of biomass, leaves, wood, etc. But a significant part of this biomass is burnt on indoor stoves, which also generate a tremendous amount of indoor air pollution. It would therefore seem there would be a strong private demand for better cooking devices, which would improve both indoor and outdoor air. But there appears to be no such demand. Study after study finds that the demand for cleaner stoves is very low. Even when an NGO distributed cleaner stoves for free, people were not interested enough to get them fixed when they broke. Low demand for clean air may come from a failure of many of the poorest households to connect clean air to healthy, happy, and productive life. This may change. Slum dwellers asked to compare the conditions of life in the city to what they had experienced in their villages mostly reported they preferred Delhi. The only thing they really complained about was the environment, and, in particular, the air. In the winter of 2017-2018, there was finally some outrage in Delhi. School children took to the streets when their schools were shut down due to the dangerously high pollution levels. Even in China, which is not a democracy, the pressure of public opinion is said to have contributed to the government's desire to do something about pollution. In India, it may soon become enough of a public issue to lead to some change. The priority should then be to enact policies that will lead to cleaner consumption patterns, even if they come at some cost. The cost may not be very large. In many cases, India would be able to leapfrog to the cleaner technology. For example, when the poor finally get electricity, they get LED bulbs. In some cases, the new technology may be more expensive than the old. For example, clean cars may be more expensive than dirty cars. This means the poor will need to be compensated. But the total cost of this is small and could easily be borne by the elite if the political will was there. A Green New Deal? With the Green New Deal, the talk of the town in the winter of 2018-2019, Democratic politicians in the United States were trying to link the fight against climate change with an agenda for economic justice and redistribution. They had an uphill political battle in front of them. From Paris to West Virginia and Delhi, fighting climate change is often presented as a luxury for the elites, funded by taxes on the less privileged. To take an example we encountered firsthand, at the end of 2018, the agitation of the Yellow Vests, protesting a planned increase in the tax on gasoline, closed down the streets of Paris every Saturday, putting the French government under severe strain. Eventually, the tax increase had to be postponed. The argument the Yellow Vest protesters were making was that the increase in the gasoline tax was a way for rich Parisians, who can take the subway to work, to buy themselves a conscience at the cost of people from the suburbs and countryside who had no choice but to drive their cars. They did have a point, given that the same government had removed the wealth tax. In the United States, the specter of a war on coal became the rallying cry against the liberal elite, a symbol of their lack of empathy for the poor. And, of course, politicians in the developing world routinely and rightly rail against having to pay for previous choices made by rich countries. The Green New Deal is an attempt to bridge precisely this divide by emphasizing the fact that building new green infrastructure, solar panels, high-speed railroads, etc., will both create jobs and help in the fight against climate change. It de-emphasizes the idea of a carbon tax, viewed by many on the left as being too reliant on market mechanisms, and, as in France, just another way to make the poor pay. We understand that a carbon tax is not an easy sell. Taxes that hit most people never are. But our view is that it should be possible to make it politically acceptable by making it absolutely explicit that the carbon tax is not a way to raise revenues. The government should structure the carbon tax in a revenue-neutral way, such that tax revenues would be handed back as a compensation, a lump sum to all those at the lower end of the income scale, who would therefore come out ahead. This would preserve the incentive to conserve energy, drive less or drive electric cars, but make it very clear that the less wealthy would not pay for it. Given that energy consumption is a matter of habit, the tax should also be announced well in advance to give people time to get ready for it. More generally, we are quite aware that it will cost money to prevent climate change and to adapt to the part already on its way. There will have to be investments in infrastructure and meaningful redistribution to those whose livelihoods are affected. In poor countries, money could help the average citizen achieve a higher quality of life in a way less threatening to the future of the world. Think of the air conditioning debate, for example. Why doesn't the world simply pay India to leapfrog to the better technology? Given that the poor do not consume very much, it would not take a lot to help the world's poor consume a bit more, but also get better air and produce less emissions. The richest countries in the world are so rich they can easily pay for it. The question is to frame the debate in a way that does not pitch the poor in poor countries against the poor in rich countries. A combination of taxes and regulations to curb emissions in rich countries and pay for a clean transition in poor countries may well reduce economic growth in the rich country, though of course we don't know for sure, since we don't know what causes growth. But if much of the cost is borne by the richest in the rich countries, and the planet benefits, we see no reason to shy away. In Delhi and Washington and Beijing, it is in the name of growth that policymakers drag their feet when called upon to enact or enforce pollution regulations. Who benefits from this GDP growth remains an afterthought. Economists deserve their fair share of the blame for stoking this rhetoric. Nothing in either our theory or the data proves the highest GDP per capita is generally desirable. Yet because we fundamentally believe resources can and will be redistributed, we fall into the trap of always trying to make the overall pie as big as possible. This flies directly in the face of what we have learned over the past decades. The evidence is clear. Inequality has risen dramatically in recent years, with searing consequences for societies across the world. Chapter 7. Player Piano. Player Piano was the very first novel published by the great American fabulist Kurt Vonnegut. It is a dystopia about a world where most jobs have disappeared. Written in 1952 in the wake of the great post-war expansion of jobs, it was either extremely far-sighted or astoundingly misguided. But either way, it's a perfect novel for our times. A player piano is a piano that plays itself. In Vonnegut's world, machines run themselves and people are no longer needed. They are provided for and get to do various forms of make work, but there is nothing meaningful or useful they can do. As Mr. Rosewater, a character in a later 1965 novel by Vonnegut puts it, "The problem is this: how to love people who have no use, or even have them not hate themselves." The increasing sophistication of robots and the progress of artificial intelligence has generated considerable anxiety about what would happen to our societies if only a few people had interesting jobs and everyone else had either no work or had a horrible job, and inequality ballooned as a result, especially if this happened because of forces largely out of their control. Tech moguls are getting desperate to find ideas to solve the problems their technologies might cause. But we don't need to contemplate the future in order to get a sense of what happens when economic growth leaves behind a majority of a country's citizens. This has already happened in the United States since 1980. One for the Luddites. An increasing number of economists, and of those who comment on economics, worry that new technologies, such as AI, robots, and automation more generally, will destroy more jobs than they create, making many workers obsolete and causing the share of GDP that goes to pay wages to dwindle. In fact, these days, growth optimists and labor pessimists are often the same people. They both imagine future growth will be primarily driven by the replacement of human workers by robots. In their book, The Second Machine Age, our MIT colleagues Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee offer a bleak view of the impact of digitization on the future of employment in the United States. Digitization, they suspect, will make workers with ordinary skills increasingly redundant. As tasks from car painting to spreadsheet manipulation are done by computers or robots, highly educated workers who are adaptable and can program and install the robots will become more and more valuable. But other workers who can be replaced will find themselves without jobs unless they accept extremely low salaries. In this view, artificial intelligence will be the final nail in the coffin of these ordinary workers. In the first IT revolution, as David Autor has shown, jobs involving routine, repetitive tasks were the ones that went. Jobs that required quick judgment and initiative stayed put. The number of typists and assembly line workers diminished, but executive assistants and burger flippers kept their jobs. This time, many say, it is different. Artificial intelligence means machines can learn as they go and are therefore able to carry out increasingly non-routine tasks, such as playing Go or folding laundry. In June 2018, a restaurant offering robot-made burgers opened in San Francisco. Humans are still taking the orders and cooking the sauces, but the robots cook the gourmet burgers, such as the Tumami burger, smoked oyster aioli, shiitake mushroom sauce, black pepper and salt, pickles, onion, butter, lettuce, designed by Chef 2, Top Chef Season 15, in 5 minutes and for $6. Esther's sister, Annie Duflo, the CEO of a large NGO, does not have a human assistant. She relies exclusively on an AI-powered assistant named Finn. Finn books her hotels and her plane tickets, manages her calendar, and takes care of her travel reimbursements. Annie is, sadly, much happier with Finn than she was with her human assistants. She pays him, her, it, much less, and gets much more reliable service. To be sure, there are some humans behind Finn, but fewer and fewer, and the business model is clearly to move away from them. The AI revolution is thus poised to hit people across a wide spectrum of jobs. Accountants, mortgage originators, management consultants, financial planners, paralegals, and sports journalists are already competing with some form of artificial intelligence, or, if not, will soon. Cynics might say it is precisely because these more high-end jobs are on the line that we are finally talking about this, and they may be right. But AI will also hurt shelf stackers, office cleaners, restaurant workers, and taxi drivers. Based on the tasks they perform, a McKinsey report concludes that 45% of U.S. jobs are at risk of being automated, and the OECD estimates that 46% of the workers in OECD countries are in occupations at high risk of being either replaced or fundamentally transformed. Of course, what this calculation misses is that as some tasks get automatized and the need for humans gets relieved, people can be put to work elsewhere. So how bad will it be on net? Economists are, of course, intrigued by this problem, but in this case they have entirely failed to reach a consensus. The IGM Booth panel of experts were asked their opinion of the following statement: holding labor market institutions and job training fixed, rising use of robots and artificial intelligence is likely to increase substantially the number of workers in advanced countries who are unemployed for long periods. 28% of respondents agreed or strongly agreed with it, 20% disagreed or strongly disagreed, and 24% were uncertain. The difficulty is that doomsday, if it is coming, has not arrived. Robert Gordon, whom, as we have seen, does not think too highly of today's innovations, likes to play spot the robot when he travels. For all the talk, he says, it is still a human clerk who checks him in at the hotel, cleans his room, serves his coffee, and so on. For the time being, humans have not been made redundant. Unemployment in the United States, as we write this book in the first quarter of 2019, is at a historical low and falling. With more and more women joining the labor force, the share of the population in the labor force rose substantially until about 2000, when it started to plateau or reverse. Jobs were found for all those who wanted to work, despite rapid labor-saving technological progress. Of course, it is true we are probably just at the very beginning of the process of AI-fueled automation. The sense that artificial intelligence is a new class of technology makes it hard to predict what it might do. Futurologists talk about a singularity, a dramatic acceleration of the rate of productivity growth fueled by infinitely intelligent machines, although most economists are quite skeptical that we are anywhere close to seeing something like that happen. But it could well be that if Gordon plays Spot the Robot in a few years, he will have a more exciting time. On the other hand, while this particular wave of automation is just starting, there have been others in the past. Like AI today, the spinning jenny, the steam engine, electricity, computer chips, and computer-assisted learning machinery all automatized and relieved the need for humans in the past. What happened then is very much what one might have expected. By replacing workers with machines on some tasks, automation has a powerful displacement effect. It makes the workers redundant. This is what happened to the skilled artisans spinning and weaving at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. They were replaced by machines. And, as is well known, they did not like it one bit. In the early 19th century, the Luddites destroyed machines to protest the mechanization of weaving, which was threatening their livelihoods as skilled artisans. The term Luddite is now mostly used pejoratively to describe someone who blindly refuses progress, and their example is often used to dismiss concerns about technology creating unemployment. After all, the Luddites were wrong. Jobs did not vanish, and wages and living conditions are much higher today than they were then. Yet the Luddites were less wrong than we might assume. Their particular jobs did vanish in the Industrial Revolution, along with the jobs of a whole range of artisans. We are told that in the long run everything was fine, but the long run was very long indeed. Real blue-collar wages in Britain were almost halved between 1755 and 1802. Although 1802 was a particularly low year, they were on a declining trend between 1755 and the turn of the century, and it is only at the turn of the century that they started increasing again. They would recover their 1755 level only in 1820, 65 years later. This period of intense technological progress in the United Kingdom was also an era of intense deprivation and very difficult living conditions. The economic historian Robert Fogel showed that boys in England during this period were significantly undernourished compared even to slaves in the U.S. South. The literature of the time, from Francis Trollope to Charles Dickens, describes what was happening to the economy and society with a certain amount of unmitigated horror. Those were hard times indeed. We know that eventually there was a turnaround in the UK. Even as some workers lost their jobs, the labor-saving innovations raised profitability of other inputs, and hence the demand for workers producing them. Improvements in weaving technology, like John Kay's flying shuttle, for example, increased demand for yarn, creating jobs for people to produce yarn. And the burgeoning wealth of those profiting from these innovations increased demand for new products and services in a range of sectors: more solicitors, accountants, engineers, bespoke tailors, gardeners, etc., which created more jobs. However, nothing tells us the rebound is guaranteed to happen. There may well be no rebound from the fall in demand for labor resulting from this wave of automation and AI. Sectors that become more profitable may invest in new labor-saving technologies instead of hiring more workers. The new wealth may be used to purchase goods made in another country. We don't know what will happen this time around, since we haven't seen the very long run yet. But the impact of the current wave of automation, which started in 1990, giving us a perspective of more than 25 years, appears so far to be negative. In a study on the impact of automation, researchers computed for each region a measure of exposure to industrial robots, capturing the spread of robots in the industries in that region. They then compared the evolution of employment and wages in the most affected areas to that in the least affected areas. The study found, to the surprise of the authors, who had written a previous paper emphasizing the forces that should lead to a rebound, large negative impacts. One more robot in a commuting zone reduces employment by 6.2 workers and also depresses wages. The employment effects are most pronounced in manufacturing, and they are particularly strong for workers with lower than a college education, especially those who do routine manual tasks. However, there are no offsetting gains in employment or wages for any other occupation or educational group. These local impacts of robots on employment and wages are reminiscent of the impacts of greater exposure to international trade. They are surprising for the same reasons. As many tasks in a particular industry get automatized, we might have expected displaced workers to find employment in new businesses that would have come to the region to take advantage of the freed-up labor or to move elsewhere. It is also worrying that the automation of simple tasks did not lead to the hiring of more engineers to supervise the robots. The explanation is probably similar to why competition with China hurt low-skilled workers. In the sticky economy, seamless reallocation is anything but guaranteed. Even if the total number of jobs does not fall, the current wave of automation tends to displace jobs that require some skills, bookkeepers and accountants, and increase the demand either for very skilled workers, software programmers for the machines, or for totally unskilled workers, dog walkers, for example, which are both much more difficult to replace with a machine. As software engineers become richer, they have more money to hire dog walkers, who have become relatively cheaper over time, since there is little alternative employment for those with no college education. Even if people remain employed, this leads to an increase in inequality, with higher wages at the top and everyone else pushed to jobs requiring no specific skills, jobs where wages and working conditions can be really bad. This accentuates a trend that has taken place since the 1980s. Workers without a college education have increasingly been pushed out of mid-skilled jobs, such as clerical and administrative roles, into low-skilled tasks, such as cleaning and security. Luddism light. So, should we try to stop the push toward automation? There are, in fact, good reasons to suspect that some of the recent automation is excessive. Corporations seem to decide to automate even when robots are less productive than people. Excessive automation reduces GDP instead of contributing to it. One reason is the bias in the U.S. tax code, which taxes labor at a higher rate than capital. Employers have to pay payroll taxes used to finance Social Security and Medicare on labor, but not on robots. They get an immediate tax rebate when they invest in the robot, since they can often claim accelerated depreciation for a capital expenditure. And if they finance it with a loan, they also get to deduct the interest from their earnings. This tax advantage gives employers an incentive to automate, even if it would otherwise cost less to keep the workers. Moreover, even without subsidies from the tax code, the many frictions in the labor market may make managers dream of factories without workers. Robots won't demand maternity leave or protest a wage cut in a recession. It is probably not an accident that automation in the retail sector, such as automatic checkout lines, started first in Europe, where the labor unions are stronger. The increase in industry concentration and monopolies could also reinforce this tendency. A monopolist does not fear competition. It has no reason to constantly reinvent what it is offering to consumers. Therefore, the monopolist will tend to focus more on cost-cutting innovations, which will increase its profit margins. In contrast, a competitive firm might go for a moonshot to try to take over the market. Now, it is true that even if a business adopts a highly productive new technology that displaces labor, the increase in productivity also creates new resources that could be deployed to find new uses for that freed labor. The technologies most dangerous for the workers are what some researchers have described as so-so automation technologies. They are just productive enough to be adopted given the distortions in the tax code and displace workers, but not productive enough to raise overall productivity. Unfortunately, notwithstanding the grandiose talk about singularities, the bulk of R&D resources these days is directed toward machine learning and other big data methods designed to automate existing tasks rather than the invention of new products that would create new roles for workers and hence new jobs. This may make economic sense for the companies, given the financial gains in replacing workers with robots, but it distracts researchers and engineers from working on the truly path-breaking innovations. For example, inventing new software or hardware health workers could use to assist patients in doing their rehabilitation therapy at home after a surgery, rather than in a hospital, could potentially save insurance companies a lot of money, improve well-being, and create new jobs. But the bulk of the automation effort today in insurance firms goes towards searching for algorithms that automate the approval of insurance claims. This saves money, but destroys jobs. The emphasis on the automation of existing jobs increases the potential for the current wave of innovation to be very damaging for workers. That unregulated automation could be bad for workers is also the instinct of most Americans on the right and left. One place, remarkably, where Republican and Democrat poll respondents agree is in their opposition to letting companies decide how much to automate. 85% of Americans would support limiting automation to dangerous and dirty jobs with no difference between Democrats and Republicans. Even when the question is posed in a more politically pointed way, asking whether there should be limits on the number of jobs businesses can replace with machines, even if they are better and cheaper than humans, 58% of Americans, including half of Republicans, say yes. This specific force of automation is exacerbating what is always a concern. When a worker is fired, the firm is done with him, but society inherits the liability of his continued well-being. Society does not want him to starve or his family to be homeless. It wants him to find another job he likes. We fear his anger, especially if it leads to a vote for the many lurking extremists in today's world, whereas the firm does not have to pay for the retraining, the welfare payments, or the social costs of the anger. This kind of argument has traditionally been used to justify making it difficult to fire workers. Some labor laws, like India's, make it virtually impossible to fire anyone in larger firms. Others, like the French laws, make it difficult and uncertain. The worker can appeal and possibly be reinstated with back pay. The problem with such firing costs is that they can make life very difficult for a manager faced with a non-performing worker or an urgent need to downsize in order to survive. As a result, firing costs may discourage hiring in the first place, which would exacerbate unemployment. The alternative to restricting firing or banning the use of robots in some sectors is a tax on robots, large enough to prevent them from being deployed unless the productivity gains are sufficiently high. This is now the subject of a serious discussion. Bill Gates has recommended it. In 2017, the European Parliament considered, but ultimately voted down, a proposed robot tax, citing concern over stifling innovation. Around the same time, however, South Korea announced the world's first robot tax. The Korean plan reduces tax subsidies for businesses investing in automation and combines it with a tax on outsourcing, so that the tax on robots does not lead to outsourcing. The problem is that while it is easy to ban self-driving cars, whether or not it's a good idea, most robots do not look like R2-D2 in Star Wars. They are typically embedded inside machines that will still have human operators, just fewer of them. How does the regulator decide where the machine stops and the robot begins? A robot tax would likely lead companies to find new ways around it, further distorting the economy. For some of these reasons, we suspect the current drive toward replacing human actions with robots cannot be prevented from taking a serious toll on the already dwindling stock of desirable jobs for low-skilled workers, first in the rich countries, but very soon everywhere. This will add, to a greater or lesser extent, to what the China shock and the other changes described in previous chapters have done to the working class in much of the developed world. It could lead to a rise in unemployment or a multiplication of poorly paid, unstable jobs. This perspective deeply worries the elites who feel responsible for and also threatened by this state of affairs. This is why the idea of a universal basic income has become so popular in Silicon Valley. Most tend to think, however, that robot-induced despair will become a problem in the future after technologies have improved even further. But the problem of high and rising inequality has already been staring us in the face in many countries, nowhere more so than in the United States. The last 30 years of U.S. history should convince us that the evolution of inequality is not the byproduct of technological changes we do not control. It is the result of policy decisions. Self-inflicted damage. By the 1980s, not only were the United States and the United Kingdom experiencing lower growth than they were accustomed to, but they also felt continental Europe and Japan catching up. Growth became a matter of national pride. It was important not just to grow, but to win the race with the other rich countries. After decades of fast growth, national pride was defined by the size of GDP and its continuous expansion. For both Margaret Thatcher in the UK and Ronald Reagan in the US, what was to blame for the slump in the late 1970s was clear, though we now know they really had no idea. The countries had drifted too far to the left. Unions were too strong. The minimum wage was too high. Taxes were too onerous. Regulation was too overbearing. Restoring growth required treating business owners better through lower taxes, deregulation, and deunionization, and getting the rest of the country to be less reliant on the government. As mentioned earlier, the idea that tax rates need to be low to avoid disaster is of recent vintage. In the United States, the top marginal tax rate was above 90% from 1951 to 1963. It declined afterward, but remained high. Under Presidents Reagan and George H.W. Bush, top tax rates came down from 70% to less than 30%. Bill Clinton pushed them back up, but only to 40%. Since then, they have bounced up and down as the U.S. presidency passes between Democrats and Republicans, but they have never gone much higher than 40%. Lower taxes were accompanied, first under Reagan and then even more strongly under Clinton, by welfare reform, in other words, gutting welfare, which was justified both on grounds of principle, the poor must be more responsible, and therefore welfare must become workfare, and out of budgetary compulsion, resulting from diminished tax collection. Unions were brought to heel, both by changing the laws and by directly using state power against them. Reagan, famously, called out the Army to break an air traffic controller's strike. Union membership has been in decline ever since. Regulations were made less restrictive, and there was a new consensus that a very compelling justification should be required before the heavy hand of the government was allowed to intervene in business. In the UK, something similar happened. The highest tax rate went from 83% in 1978 to 60% in 1979, and then to 40%, and has remained close to that ever since. The very two powerful unions of the post-war era were taken down with a firm hand. The miners' strike of 1984 was a defining moment of Margaret Thatcher's rule, and have never recovered. Deregulation became the norm, though the integration with regulation-friendly Europe limited how far it could go. The one difference between the UK and the US is that there was never a major attempt to cut welfare. Mrs. Thatcher apparently wanted to, but her cabinet colleagues dissuaded her. Public spending did fall from 45% of GDP to 34% during the Thatcher years, but it then partially recovered under subsequent governments. The reason why such radical changes were possible probably had a lot to do with the anxiety that came with slowing growth. Despite the fact that there is no evidence massive tax cuts for the rich promote economic growth, we are still waiting for the promised turnaround in growth in both the U.S. and the U.K. At the time, the evidence was much less clear. Since growth had stopped in 1973, the natural reaction was to turn to the critics of the Keynesian macroeconomic policies of the 1960s and 1970s, such as the right-leaning Chicago School of Economics professors and Nobel Prize winners Milton Friedman and Robert Lucas. Reaganomics, as the dominant economics of this period came to be called, was quite open about the fact that the benefits of growth would come at the cost of some inequality. The idea was that the rich would benefit first, but the poor would eventually benefit. This is the famous trickle-down theory, never better described than by Harvard professor John Kenneth Galbraith, who claimed this was what used to be called the horse and sparrow theory in the 1890s. If you feed the horse enough oats, some will pass through to the road for the sparrows. Indeed, the 1980s ushered a dramatic change in the social contract in the U.S. and the U.K. Whatever economic growth happened since 1980 has been, for all intents and purposes, siphoned off by the rich. Was Reaganomics or its UK version responsible for it? The Great Reversal. In the 1980s, while growth remained sluggish, inequality exploded. Thanks to the outstanding and painstaking work of Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez, the world now knows what happened. 1980 is the year Reagan was elected. It is also almost exactly the year the share of national income that goes to the richest 1% reverses 50 years of decline and starts a relentless climb in the United States. In 1928, at the end of the Roaring Twenties, the richest 1% captured 24% of the income. In 1979, that number was about a third as big. In 2017, the last year to be included at the time of writing, that ratio was almost back where it was in 1929. The increase in income inequality was accompanied by a rise in wealth inequality. Income is what people earn every year. Wealth is their accumulated fortune, although wealth inequality has not yet reached its early 1920s level. The top 1% wealth share in the United States rose from 22% in 1980 to 39% in 2014. The story for the UK is very similar. The turning point, like in the U.S., is somewhere very close to 1979, the year Mrs. Thatcher took over. Before 1979, the top income share falls steadily from 1920. After 1979, there is a similar rise, interrupted briefly by the global financial crisis of 2009. Unlike in the United States, inequality has not yet reached the 1920s level, but it does not have that far to go. In continental Europe, the pattern is strikingly different. Before 1920, the top income share in France or Germany, Switzerland or Sweden, the Netherlands or Denmark, was not too different from that in the U.S. or U.K. But sometime after 1920, inequality crashed in all of these countries, like in the United States, and stayed down, unlike in the United States. There are small ups and downs, and Sweden actually has a significant upswing starting somewhere in the 1980s, but the levels remain very low by U.S. standards. These data are about pre-tax income, before the rich paid taxes and the poor received transfers. Therefore, they do not take into account any attempt to redistribute from the rich to the poor. Since taxes went down in the United States, we might have expected post-tax inequality to increase even more than pre-tax inequality after 1979. One does see a small blip up at the time of the Tax Reform Act of 1986, but for the most part, the curves for pre-tax and post-tax income shares track each other. Taxes are important for redistribution, but the increase in inequality is a much deeper phenomenon than a mechanical effect of lower redistribution. At the same time, around 1980, wages stopped increasing, at least for the least educated. The average hourly wage adjusted for inflation for U.S. workers who were not managers rose through the 1960s and 1970s, reached its peak in the mid to late 1970s, and then drifted down through the Reagan-Bush years, before slowly turning around. As a result, the average real wage in 2014 was no higher than in 1979. Over the same period, from 1979 to today, the real wages of the least educated workers actually fell. Among high school dropouts, high school graduates, and those with some college, real weekly earnings among full-time male workers in 2018 were 10 to 20% below their real levels in 1980. If there had been any trickle-down effect of lower taxes, as its advocates claimed, one would expect wage growth to have accelerated in the Reagan-Bush years, but the opposite happened. The labor share, the share of revenues used to pay wages, has continuously declined since the 1980s. In manufacturing, almost 50% of sales were used to pay workers in 1982. It had fallen to about 10% in 2012. The fact that this great reversal takes place during the Reagan and Thatcher years is probably not coincidental, but there is no reason to assume Reagan and Thatcher were the reason it happened. Their election was also a symptom of the politics of the time, dominated by anxiety about the end of growth. It is not impossible that if they had lost, whoever won would have gone some distance along the same path. More importantly, it is not a priori obvious that Reagan-Thatcher policies were the main reason why inequality went up. The diagnosis of what actually happened in this period, with its obvious implications for policy, has been and continues to be an active area of debate within economics, with some, like Thomas Piketty, squarely blaming changes in policies, while most economists emphasize that the structural transformation of the economy and particular changes in technologies also had a lot to do with it. The reason why this is not an easy question is that this was also a period of momentous change in the world economy. Starting in 1979, China launched market reforms. In 1984, India started taking baby steps toward liberalization. These countries would eventually become two of the largest markets in the world. Partly as a result, world trade expanded relative to the world GDP by about 50% over this period, with the consequences we discussed in Chapter 3. The advent of computing was the other characteristic feature of the era. Microsoft was founded in 1975. In 1976, the Apple I was released, followed by the much more widely sold Apple II in 1977. IBM released its first personal computer in 1981. Also, in 1979, NTT launched the first widely distributed handheld cell phone system in Japan. Mostly on the strength of selling cell phones, Apple became the first trillion-dollar company in August 2018. To what extent did technological change and globalization explain the pattern of increase in inequality in the U.S. and the U.K.? To what extent did policy, tax policy in particular, play a role? With computerization came other technological change. This may not have been a revolution in the sense that the steam engine brought in a revolution, as Robert Gordon argued, but like the steam engine and its love child, the internal combustion engine, it killed a lot of jobs. No one probably makes a living by being a typist now, except the 3 lone men of uncertain age who sit under a tree near where Abhijit grew up in Kolkata, who, for a small fee, will type in your name and address into government-issued documents. There are few stenographers left. Even in the White House, their days appear to be numbered. And this technological progress was to a large extent skewed against the less qualified. This skill-biased technological change clearly explains the increase in the return to college education. But it cannot explain what happened at the very top of the income distribution, unless we think skills were suddenly transmogrified just for the very richest. We usually think of skills increasing relatively continuously with education and wage levels. So, if the explosion of top-income inequality was just due to technological progress, the widening of the distribution of wages should have been not just for the ultra-rich, but also for the merely rich. But in fact, those making, say, between $100,000 and $200,000 a year have seen their pay increase only slightly more rapidly than the average, while those who are making more than $500,000 have seen their incomes explode. This suggests that plausible changes in technology are unlikely to explain the stratospheric increase in incomes at the very top, nor, for that matter, can they explain the difference between the United States and continental Europe. Technological change has been similar in all rich countries. Winner take all? However, technology has also changed the organization of the economy. A lot of the most successful inventions that came out of the high-tech revolution were winner-take-all products. There was no point in being on MySpace when the whole world was on Facebook, and Twitter is meaningless unless someone is retweeting your tweets. Technological innovations have also transformed existing industries and created large benefits from being connected to industries where they used to be largely absent, like hospitality or transportation. For example, if drivers know that all passengers use a particular ride-sharing platform, they will choose to stay on that one. Conversely, if passengers know that all drivers use a particular platform, that is where they will go. These network effects explain in part the dominance of giant tech companies like Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Uber, and Airbnb, but also of old economy behemoths such as Walmart and Federal Express. In addition, the globalization of demand has increased the value of brands, as rich Chinese and Indian customers can now aspire to the same goods. And the ability to browse, compare, and boast on Facebook has made consumers more aware of differences in prices and quality, but also more sensitive to fads. The result is a winner-take-all, or if not all, most economy, in which a few firms capture a large part of the market. As we saw in the chapter on growth, in many sectors sales have become more concentrated, and we see the increasing dominance of superstar firms. And in sectors that have become more concentrated, the share of revenues going to pay wages has gone down more. This is because those firms, which are monopolies or near monopolies, make more profits, and those tend to be distributed to shareholders. The increase in concentration thus helps explain a part of why wages are not keeping pace with GDP. The rise of the superstar firms also offers an explanation for why overall wage inequality has been rising. Some firms are now much more profitable than others, and they pay higher wages. It is also true that profitability is more variable than it used to be, with more clear winners and clear losers even outside the set of superstars. In fact, in the United States, the increase in inequality between the average salaries at different companies can explain 2/3 of the overall rise in inequality. Increase in inequality between workers within the same company explains the rest. A lot of this increase in inequality between firms seems due to changes in who works where. The highest-paid workers in low-paying firms are moving to those that pay more. If one assumes that higher earnings reflect higher productivity, which is probably true on average, then the most productive workers are increasingly working with other high-productivity workers. This is consistent with the theory in which superstar firms attract both capital and good workers. If more productive people benefit more from being paired with other productive people, then the market should drive such people to come together to form high-productivity firms that would, as a result, have higher wages and salaries than other firms. Moreover, once a firm has invested in a galaxy of talents, the CEO of such a firm is in a position to make a big difference. If he pushes them down the wrong path, he would waste a whole lot of productive capacity. Therefore, such firms should strive to get the best CEO possible, even if that requires paying him or her what some may feel is an obscene salary. The rise in top incomes, in this view, is just the flip side of the rise of superstar firms that value getting the best top management and are willing to pay a lot for them. That the economy is sticky also contributes to the rise in inequality between firms. As production in some sectors gets concentrated in superstar firms, other firms in those sectors all over the country are shutting down. Think of the local department store versus Amazon, in addition to those that shut down because of the effect of new technology or trade. Since workers do not move out, wage growth in the affected area flattens or gets reversed, and rents do the same. This is good news for the surviving firms in those pockets, especially if their clients are elsewhere. The resulting windfall in profits may lead to greater investment in these companies, but probably not enough to halt the overall decline of the area. In other words, part of the distinction between good firms and bad firms may be purely happenstance. If you are a firm in a failing local economy, lucky enough to be able to continue to sell to the national or world economy, you can do very well, at least for a while, until the overall drain in talent from these places, as the young and the ambitious move out, starts to hurt. In other words, globalization and the rise of the infotech industry, combined with the sticky economy, and no doubt with other important but perhaps more local changes, created a world of good and bad firms, which in turn contributed to an increase in inequality. In this view, what happened may have been unfortunate, but it probably could not have been stopped. Something is not rotten in the state of Denmark. But the winner-take-all explanation for the rise in inequality cannot be the whole story either. The reason is that, like skill-biased technological progress, the explanation ought to apply to Denmark just as much as the United States. But it does not. Denmark is a capitalist country where the share of income going to the top 1% was more than 20% in the 1920s, just like in the United States. But when it went down, it stayed low, and now hovers around 5%. Denmark is a small country, but it has a number of large and well-known companies, including the shipping giant Maersk, Bang & Olufsen, the maker of beautiful consumer electronics products, and the Tuborg Brewery. But its top incomes never went sky high. The same is true of many very different countries in Western Europe and also of Japan. What's different between these countries and the United States? A part of the answer is finance. The U.S. and U.K. dominate the high end of finance, the investment banks, junk bonds, hedge funds, mortgage-backed securities, private equity, quants, etc. And this is where many of the astronomical earnings have shown up in recent years. Two finance professors at Harvard Business School, of all places, estimate that investors who use financial market intermediaries pay 1.3% of their total investment to their fund manager every year, which over the 30-year horizon of an investor saving for retirement amounts to handing the manager a third of the assets initially invested. A chunk of change, but nothing compared to those who manage the hedge funds, private equity funds, and venture capital funds that epitomize high-end finance, where, at least until recently, you had to pay the managers between 3% and 5% of the amount invested every year. Given that the amount invested is growing steadily, it is no wonder some of these managers are becoming very, very rich. Financial sector employees are now paid 50 to 60% more than other workers with comparable skills. This was not true in the 1950s, 1960s, or 1970s. This rise in earnings is a big piece of the overall shift in top incomes. In the UK, which is the most finance-dominated large economy, between 1998 and 2007, employees in the financial sector, who represented only about 1/5 of those in the top 1%, swallowed 60% of the rise in earnings in this group. In the United States, from 1979 to 2005, the share of top incomes going to finance professionals almost doubled. In France, where finance still mostly means banking and insurance, the change in inequality was much smaller in absolute terms. Between 1996 and 2007, the share of national income going to the richest 0.1% of the population went up from 1.2% to 2%. It then went down during the financial crisis, but had recovered partly by 2014. But about half of that increase, it is estimated, is due to increasing earnings in finance. The superstar narrative does not fit finance very well. Finance is not a team sport. It is an industry marked, supposedly, by individual geniuses, people who can spot the particular irrationalities currently infecting the markets or identify the next Google or Facebook before anybody else. But it is hard to see how that explains why an ordinary manager in the financial sector is nonetheless paid extraordinary fees year after year. In fact, most years, actively managed funds do not do any better than passive funds that simply replicate the stock market index. In fact, the average U.S. mutual funds underperform the U.S. stock market. They seem to have borrowed the language of individual talent, but not the talent itself. A large part of the premiums paid to financial sector employees are almost surely pure rents, that is, rewards not for talent or hard work, but for nothing more than having lucked out in landing that particular job. These rents, much like the rents from government jobs in poor countries discussed in Chapter 5, distort the entire functioning of the labor market. As the 2008 global crisis unfolded, caused in large part by a combination of irresponsibility and incompetence on the part of the masters of finance, a study reported that 28% of Harvard College graduates of recent cohorts opted for jobs in finance. That ratio was 6% in 1969 and 1973. The reason to be concerned about this is that if some job pays a premium unrelated to its usefulness, like the fund managers earning a fat fee for doing nothing, or the many talented MIT engineers and scientists hired to write software that allows stock trading at millisecond frequencies, then talented people are lost to firms that might do something more socially useful. Faster trading may be profitable because it allows the trader to react more quickly to new information, but given that the reaction time is already seconds or less, it seems implausible that it improves the allocation of resources in the economy in any meaningful way. And hiring the brightest of the bright may be an effective tool for a financial firm to market itself, but if the firm does nothing useful, those talents are lost to the world. Maybe, in a saner world, they would have been writing the next great symphony or curing pancreatic cancer. There is another problem. The salaries and bonuses of CEOs of the larger corporations are set by board of directors compensation committees, and these committees use the salaries of CEOs of comparable firms as a benchmark. This creates a contagion. If one company, say in finance, starts to pay its CEO more, others, not necessarily in finance, feel they have to as well to keep getting the best. Their CEOs feel undervalued compared to the CEOs they play golf with. Consultants who help the CEOs compile a list of what happens in comparable firms are very skilled at selecting a sample of particularly high salaries. The high finance salaries tend to infest the rest of the economy as well. The practice of using salary comparisons to negotiate increased compensation has spread far beyond the largest firms and even beyond the for-profit sector. This is not helped by the fact that CEOs everywhere, and not just in finance, try very hard to pack boards of directors with people they feel they can control, or people who are only interested in getting paid their directors' fees. The result is that CEOs are often rewarded for pure luck. When the stock market valuation of the firm goes up, even if it is due to pure chance, for example, world crude oil prices went up, the exchange rate moved in the firm's favor, their salary increases. The one exception, which in some ways proves the rule, is that CEOs of companies where there is a single large shareholder who sits on the board and is vigilant because it is his own money on the line, gets paid significantly less for luck than for genuinely productive management. Stock options probably contributed to the skyrocketing CEO salaries by normalizing the idea that CEO pay was directly linked to shareholder value and nothing else. In addition, linking managerial pay to the stock market meant that managers' pay was no longer linked to a salary scale within the enterprise. When everyone was on the same scale, CEOs had to grow salaries at the bottom to increase their own. With stock options, they had no reason to increase wages at the bottom, and in fact every reason to squeeze costs. Paternalism, once a feature of the large corporations that demanded loyalty but took care of their own, is now restricted to elite workers in software companies and is expressed in the form of free food and dry cleaning in exchange for long hours. One solution to the puzzle posed by Denmark might be that finance is much more dominant in the UK and the US than in continental Europe, and perhaps a more attractive option for those countries' elite graduates. Relatedly, stock options, and stock market-linked compensation more generally, are much more likely to get used in the Anglo-Saxon world, where more people are familiar with the stock market and where most reasonable-sized companies are traded.